Welcome to Midnight Mirage Stories, where story feels real but not.
The Man Who Only Appears at 11:59. A Mystery by Midnight Mirage. Narrated by Vincent Crow.
At 11:59 p.m., the town of Belmere held its breath. It did not do so loudly. There were no sirens, no tolling bells, no official decree from City Hall. The breath was quieter than that, like the hush that falls over a house when someone mentions a ghost at the dinner table. Screens dimmed. Conversations faltered. Fingers paused above keyboards. The digital clock on every stove, dashboard, bedside table, and phone display seemed to glow with a private intensity, as if each device knew it was about to witness something it could never record. At 11:59 p.m., he appeared. No one could say precisely when it started. Some traced it back to a summer 3 years ago, when the power grid had failed for 9 long seconds across 3 counties. Others swore it had begun after the old Belmere Observatory was demolished to make way for condominiums that sold out before their foundations cured. A few insisted he had always been there, slipping between seconds, and that it was only recently that people began to notice the thin seam in time where he stood. He never appeared at midnight. That was the strange part. Midnight came and went like any other minute. It was the minute before, 11:59 p.m., that belonged to him. The first widely shared account came from a high school student named Talia Verne. She had been studying for her calculus final, exhausted and half-mad with derivatives, when she glanced up at the microwave clock glowing green across the kitchen. 11:59 p.m. She remembered it clearly because she had promised herself she would stop studying at midnight and sleep. At 11:59 p.m. exactly, someone knocked on the back door. 3 knocks. Measured. Polite. Talia froze. Her parents were asleep upstairs. The backyard was fenced. Motion sensor lights remained dark. Another 3 knocks. Hard hammering, she crept to the door and peered through the narrow pane of glass. A man stood there. He wore a charcoal gray coat that seemed too heavy for June and held a small leather-bound notebook. His hair was dark, parted neatly. His expression was calm, almost apologetic. He looked directly at her and mouthed, "May I?" The microwave clock still read 11:59 p.m. Talia fumbled with the lock before her fear could argue her out of it. The door opened without a creak. Night air brushed her arms. The man did not step inside. He simply inclined his head. "Good evening," he said. His voice carried no accent she could place. It sounded like the neutral tone of an audiobook narrator. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I only have a minute," he replied gently. "Perhaps less. I'm here to ask you a question." The microwave clock still read 11:59 p.m. Talia would later swear that the air felt thicker, like syrup, and that the distant hum of the refrigerator had deepened into something like a sustained note. Everything else in the world had slowed, not stopped, but slowed enough that this moment stood apart. "What question?" she asked. He opened the notebook. Its pages seemed blank from where she stood. "When you think of your life 10 years from now," he said, "are you running towards something, or away from something?" The question struck her like cold water. She opened her mouth, then closed it. 10 years. She had barely survived the last 10 days. I don't know," she stammered. He studied her face, not impatiently, but as if measuring the shape of her uncertainty. "You do," he said softly. "You just haven't chosen which truth to say aloud." Talia felt a surge of irritation through her fear. "Why does it matter?" "Because this is the minute where choices echo the loudest," he said. The microwave clock flickered. Still 11:59 p.m. She thought of her father's insistence that she pursue engineering, of her own quiet desire to study art history, of the way she felt like a fraud in calculus and like herself in museums. She imagined herself a decade older, standing in a city far from Belmere, explaining brushstrokes to strangers. Instead, she found herself fielding calls from neighbors about the man who only appears at 11:59 p.m. At first, she dismissed it. Mass hysteria was not uncommon in close-knit communities. But the consistency of the accounts troubled her. Different ages. Different professions. Different neighborhoods. All describing the same minute, the same notebook, the same vanishing at midnight. Mara decided to investigate. Not to prove his existence, but to understand why so many people needed him to exist. She began with Talia Verne, now a sophomore studying art history 2 states away. They met at a cafe during Talia's winter break. Snow pressed against the windows. The clock above the counter ticked toward evening. "Do you think he was real?" Mara asked. Talia stirred her coffee, eyes distant. "He felt real. That's not the same thing." "I know." She hesitated. "But he knew something. Not details. Not facts. He knew what I was avoiding." "Couldn't that have been you?" Mara pressed. "Your own conscience?" Talia smiled faintly. "Maybe. But my conscience never knocked." Mara interviewed dozens more. Patterns emerged. The man never forced an answer. He never gave orders. He asked. He listened. Occasionally he offered a sentence, cryptic, but precise. "Grief is love with nowhere to go. Ambition without joy is just hunger. You cannot outrun a mirror." Mara collected these phrases in her notebook. She noticed something else. The people he visited were always at a crossroads. A decision pending. A threshold unacknowledged. As if he arrived at the brink. Mara decided to try something reckless. On the anniversary of her divorce, she stayed awake. She sat in her living room, lights off, laptop closed, phone face down. The house creaked softly as winter wind pressed against it. The digital clock on her cable box read 11:56 p.m. She did not know what she would say if he appeared. She did not know whether she believed he would. "I'm running 11:57 p.m., she said. "But I'm scared of disappointing people." The man smiled, and for a moment his eyes shone with something like pride. "Disappointment fades," he said. "Regret calcifies." The microwave clock clicked. 12 a.m. The man vanished. Not stepped back. Not dissolved into smoke. He was simply gone. The backyard stood empty beneath a sky heavy with stars. Talia slammed the door and locked it, her pulse roaring in her ears. She checked the microwave. 12 a.m. Her phone. 12 a.m. The stove. 12 a.m. The next morning, she told no one. She changed her college applications 2 months later. Within weeks, others began to speak. A widower claimed the man had appeared in his living room while he sat staring at his late wife's photograph. A nurse on the night shift at Belmere General said she saw him standing at the end of a hospital bed, speaking quietly to a patient whose heart would stop at 12:07 a.m. A delivery driver swore the man had been in the back of his truck at 11:59 p.m., seated calmly among cardboard boxes, asking him why he kept apologizing for a life he had every right to live. Each account shared 3 details. He appeared only at 11:59 p.m. He stayed until midnight. He asked a question? The questions varied. To some, he asked about love. To others, about forgiveness, ambition, resentment, fear. The minutes stretched long enough for a conversation, but never longer. At 12:00 a.m., he vanished. The town reacted as towns do. At first, with disbelief. Then with jokes. Memes circulated. Someone printed t-shirts that read, "See you at 11:59. A local radio host dedicated a segment to caller stories, alternating between skepticism and fascination. Then came the recordings. Belmere prided itself on its security systems. Doorbell cameras, motion detectors, baby monitors, every square foot of the town seemed under quiet surveillance. If a man was appearing at doors and in living rooms, surely someone had caught him on video. Footage reviewed from multiple households showed something peculiar. At 11:58 p.m., everything looked normal. At 12 a.m., everything looked normal. But at 11:59 p.m., There was distortion. Not static. Not a glitch in the usual sense. The image seemed to ripple, like heat rising off asphalt. Sometimes a faint outline appeared in the distortion, vaguely human-shaped. Sometimes there was a shadow where none should be. But no clear image. Audio fared no better. At 11:59 p.m., recordings filled with a low, sustained hum. Not white noise. A single note, barely perceptible, as if the world itself were humming. The Belmere Police Department opened an inquiry. They interviewed witnesses, cross-referenced timelines, examined footage. The official conclusion, released after 2 months, cited mass suggestion, stress-induced hallucinations, and technological anomalies. The appearances continued. For some, the encounter was transformative. A man who had not spoken to his brother in 12 years called him the next day and apologized. A woman who had postponed leaving an abusive relationship finally packed her bags. A teenager who had planned to end his life at midnight found himself talking instead, tears streaming down his face, answering a stranger's question about what kind of world he wished he'd been born into. But not everyone welcomed him. There were those who resented the intrusion. A city councilman declared the phenomenon a form of psychological terrorism. A preacher denounced the man as a demonic presence, a tempter who sowed doubt in righteous hearts. A tech entrepreneur offered a reward to anyone who could capture indisputable footage. And then there was Mara Ellison. Mara was a journalist, though not the kind who chased ghosts. She had returned to Belmere after a decade in the city, her career stalled, her marriage dissolved into a polite arrangement of signed papers and divided furniture. She had intended to write a series on small-town in anticipation she despised herself for feeling. 11:58 p.m. The air seemed to thicken. 11:59 p.m. A knock at the front door. 3 knocks. Measured. Polite. Mara did not move at first. She felt anger flare through her fear. How dare this phenomenon conform to expectation? How dare it knock like a cliché? Another 3 knocks. She stood and crossed the room. She did not check the peephole. She opened the door. He stood on her porch, charcoal gray coat immaculate despite the snow. The leather notebook rested against his chest. His expression was composed, but his eyes held a flicker of something she could not name, recognition, perhaps. "Good evening, Mara," he said. Her throat tightened. She had never published her investigation. She had spoken to sources confidentially. She had not announced her vigil. "You know who I am," she said. "I only have a minute," he replied. "May I?" She stepped aside, more out of defiance than hospitality. He entered the house without brushing against her. The air shifted with him, that subtle thickening she had read about but never believed. The cable box clock glowed, 11:59 p.m. He did not sit. He stood in the center of her living room and opened his notebook. Its pages, she noticed now, were not blank. They were filled with lines of writing so fine they seemed like threads. "What are you?" she demanded. He looked up. "That is not your question. It is now." A faint smile touched his mouth. "I am not here to satisfy curiosity. I am here to ask." She folded her arms. "Fine. Ask." He studied her as if flipping through invisible pages. "When you left the city," he said, "did you come back to Belmere to begin again, or to confirm what you believe about yourself?" The question struck deeper than she expected. She felt heat rise to her face. "What do I believe about myself?" "You were always almost," she shot back, he said gently. "Almost successful. Almost loved. Almost brave enough to risk something without a fallback plan." Anger surged. "You don't know me. I know the edge of you," he replied. The clock still read 11:59 p.m. Mara's mind raced. Almost. The word echoed. She thought of the book proposal she had never submitted, the confrontation she had rehearsed but never delivered, the city she had left before it could reject her. "I came back because I failed," she said, the admission tasting metallic. Is that the same as beginning? He asked. She opened her mouth to argue. Stopped. The room felt suspended, like a held breath stretching beyond comfort. What happens if I don't answer? She asked. Midnight arrives, he said simply. The clock flickered. 11:59 p.m. She exhaled slowly. I came back because I was afraid of finding out whether I could succeed, she said. It's easier to fail in a place that already knows you. His eyes softened. Then your choice, he said, is whether Belmere is your refuge or your rehearsal. The clock clicked. 12 a.m. He vanished. Mara stood alone in her living room, heart pounding. Snow fell outside as if nothing had shifted. The next day she wrote. Not an article about the man. Not yet. She wrote the book proposal she had abandoned 2 years prior. She sent it without editing it into oblivion. She did not tell anyone why. Belmere changed in subtle ways over the next year. Some residents began to anticipate 11:59 p.m., sitting awake as Mara had. Not all were visited. In fact, many were not. The man's appearances remained selective, unpredictable. Those who waited without a crossroads in their lives found the minute uneventful. The clock turned. Midnight came. Nothing. Rumors grew that he could sense thresholds invisible even to the person standing on them. A support group formed, not for believers, but for the visited. They met weekly in the basement of the public library. They shared their questions, their answers, and what had followed. One woman confessed that the man had asked her why she kept mistaking silence for peace. 2 months later, she filed for separation. A retired teacher said he had been asked what he would teach if no curriculum constrained him. He began volunteering at a youth center, teaching philosophy to teenagers who had never heard the word. Not every outcome was triumphant. A young man admitted that he had lied to the visitor, claiming he was content when he was not. I thought I could trick him, he said, voice shaking. But I think I tricked myself. He had changed nothing since. The town's skepticism softened into a wary respect. Even those who denied the man's literal existence began to acknowledge the impact of the minute. Mara continued her research, though her focus shifted. She stopped trying to prove what he was. Instead, she mapped what happened after. She noticed that those who answered honestly experienced disruption. Jobs left. Relationships altered. Habits broken. It was as if the minute at 11:59 p.m. cracked something open, and midnight allowed the consequences to spill into the new day. The entrepreneur who had offered a reward escalated his efforts. He installed a custom array of high-speed cameras in his home, synchronized to atomic clocks. He hired a physicist to monitor electromagnetic fluctuations at 11:59 p.m. On the night he was visited, every device in his house shut down at once. He described the man standing in his office, regarding him with mild curiosity. Why do you need proof? The man had asked. To control the narrative. The entrepreneur had replied automatically. And what would you lose? The man continued. If something existed beyond your control? The entrepreneur had no ready answer. At 12 a.m., the power surged back. His data was corrupted beyond his first encounter. A tragedy struck Belmere. A fire tore through an apartment complex just before midnight. Faulty wiring, investigators later concluded. The blaze spread quickly. Firefighters arrived within minutes, but smoke filled the hallways. A mother and her young son were trapped on the 3rd floor. At 11:59 p.m., as flames licked the stairwell, the boy later told reporters, a man appeared in their kitchen. He wore a charcoal gray coat. He did not knock. He told my mom to break the window, the boy said, wide-eyed. He said the ladder was already coming. The mother corroborated the account. She had hesitated, fearing the drop. The man had asked her a single question. Do you trust the people who are trying to save you? She had nodded, though terror clawed at her throat. The man had smiled. Then act like it. She smashed the window with a chair. Moments later, a firefighter's ladder reached their floor. They escaped with minor injuries. Fire department records confirmed that the ladder had been positioned at 11:59 p.m. Skeptics argued that stress-induced hallucination explained the sighting. Adrenaline could distort perception. The timing was coincidence. But the boy insisted on one detail that unsettled even the most rational observers. "The clock in the kitchen," he said, "was stuck on 11:59 until we were outside. Then it changed." Belmere began to regard the minute with something like reverence. Churches held optional vigils. Therapists extended late-night hours. Couples chose to have difficult conversations at 11:59 p.m., half-joking that perhaps he would mediate. Mara's book proposal was accepted by a small but respected publisher. She titled it The Brink Minute. She did not claim the man was supernatural. She did not dismiss him as delusion. She wrote about thresholds, about the psychology of decision, about the peculiar human need for a witness when choosing who to become, though she omitted his words. On the night her manuscript was due, she found herself glancing at the clock as 11:59 p.m. approached. She had not seen him since. She did not expect to. The clock turned. 11:59 p.m. Silence. No knock. No distortion in the air. She exhaled, a mix of relief and something like disappointment. 12 a.m. Her email whooshed as the manuscript sent. Months later, on the eve of the book's release, Mara received a package with no return address. Inside lay a small leather-bound notebook. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The pages were filled with lines of writing so fine they seemed like threads. Names appeared, hundreds of them. Dates. Questions. Brief notations. She found Talia Vern's name. Beneath it, the question about running toward or away. A single word followed, toward. She found the widower. The nurse. The entrepreneur. The boy from the fire. At the back of the notebook, one page remained blank. Her name was written at the top. Below it, no question. Only a line. Refuge or rehearsal? She checked the clock on her wall. 11:59 p.m. A knock sounded at her door. 3 knocks. Measured. Polite. Mara closed the notebook and stood. This time, she did not feel anger or fear. She felt something steadier, like recognition. She opened the door. He stood there, charcoal gray coat, eyes calm. "I only have a minute," he said. She nodded. "I know." He did not open a notebook. He did not need to. "What happens when the town no longer needs you?" she asked before he could speak. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. "That is not your question," he said gently. "Maybe it is." The air thickened. The clock behind her glowed, 11:59 p.m. He regarded her with that same measuring gaze. "When the town no longer needs me," he said slowly, "it will not notice my absence." "And do you want that?" she pressed. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering something he rarely examined. Of town, an elderly man named Arthur Hales sat alone in his armchair. He had outlived his friends, his siblings, even his doctor. His hands trembled slightly as he held a photograph of himself at 20, standing before the old observatory. He had built that observatory. He had designed its rotating dome, calculated the angles, aligned its lenses. He had loved it more fiercely than anything except his late wife. When the city council voted to demolish it, citing budget constraints and development potential, Arthur had attended the meeting and said nothing. He had gone home and watched the bulldozers arrive weeks later, telling himself it was inevitable. Now, at 87, he found himself thinking of that silence. 11:59 p.m. A knock at his door. 3 knocks. Measured. Polite. Arthur did not startle. He set the photograph aside and rose slowly, joints protesting. He opened the door. The man stood there, unchanged by time. "Good evening, Arthur," he said. Arthur chuckled softly. "Took you long enough." "I only have a minute," the man replied. Arthur nodded. "I suppose you do." They stood facing each other in the cool night air. The digital clock on the stove behind Arthur read 11:59 p.m. The man's gaze was steady, but there was a hint of something like respect in it. "When they tore it down," the man said, "why did you say nothing?" Arthur leaned against the doorframe. "I thought I'd lose. And was that worse than losing it anyway?" Arthur smiled, rueful. "You don't pull punches, do you?" "There is no time," the man said softly. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. "I was tired," he admitted. "I had spent my life arguing for budgets, for grants, for repairs. I told myself I deserved to rest. But truth is, I was afraid of being the old fool shouting about stars." The clock flickered. "I am not built for wanting." 11:59 p.m., he said. She studied him. For the first time, she saw something fragile beneath his composure, a faint weariness, perhaps, or longing. "Then what are you built for?" she asked. The clock flickered. He stepped back onto the porch. "For the minute," he said. 12 a.m. He vanished. Years passed. Belmere grew. The condominiums replaced the observatory. A tech hub opened downtown. Talia returned after graduate school and curated a gallery in a renovated warehouse. The entrepreneur launched a foundation funding mental health initiatives at 11:59 p.m. sessions. The support group at the library dissolved, its members scattered into lives reshaped. The appearances grew less frequent. Weeks passed without a single account. Then months. Some worried he had left. Others argued that perhaps the town had learned to ask itself the necessary questions. On a quiet autumn night, nearly a decade after the first widely shared encounter, the digital clocks across Belmere turned to 11:59 p.m. In a small house on the edge of town, an elderly man named Arthur Hales sat alone in his armchair. He had outlived his friends, his siblings, even his doctor. His hands trembled slightly as he held a photograph of himself at 20, standing before the old observatory. He had built that observatory. He had designed its rotating dome, calculated the angles, aligned its lenses. He had loved it more fiercely than anything except his late wife. When the city council voted to demolish it, citing budget constraints and development potential, Arthur had attended the meeting and said nothing. He had gone home and watched the bulldozers arrive weeks later, telling himself it was inevitable. Now, at 87, he found himself thinking of that silence. The man asked. Arthur opened his eyes. They were clear. "Yes," he said. "But not because it fell. Because I didn't stand with it." The man inclined his head. "And now?" he asked. Arthur glanced at the photograph on the table. "Now I tell the kids at the high school about it. I show them the blueprints. I tell them the sky is still there." A faint smile touched the man's mouth. The clock clicked. 12 a.m. Arthur found himself alone on his porch, night stretching quiet and immense above him. For a moment, he thought he saw a faint shimmer in the sky, like heat rising off asphalt. He stepped back inside and closed the door. Across Belmere, digital clocks glowed 12 a.m. No distortion. No hum. The minute had passed. In the years that followed, the stories of the man who only appears at 11:59 p.m. became part of local lore. Newcomers heard them at dinner parties. Children dared each other to stay awake and wait for a knock that rarely came. The town's website even included a playful FAQ section about the 11:59 phenomenon, equal parts humor and respect. But the appearances dwindled to almost none. Mara, now gray at the temples and twice published, would sometimes sit awake at 11:59 p.m., not waiting, but remembering. She no longer needed a knock to ask herself difficult questions. The minute still felt charged, but the charge came from within. On the 10th anniversary of her first encounter, she walked to the site where the observatory had once stood. The condominiums towered overhead, windows reflecting the night sky. She checked her watch. 11:59 p.m. She did not expect him. She closed her eyes and listened. For a fleeting second, she thought she heard that low, sustained hum, like the world holding a note. She opened her eyes. The sky above Belmere stretched wide and indifferent, pricked with stars no bulldozer could touch. Her watch turned.
No knock came. 12 a.m.
But somewhere in the town, a young woman stared at her bedroom ceiling, wrestling with a decision about leaving home. Somewhere else, a man hovered over the send button of an apology he had drafted a dozen times. Somewhere, an exhausted nurse considered whether to apply for the program that might change her career. The clocks would turn to 11:59 p.m. again. Whether or not he appeared, the minute would remain. A threshold. A brink. A question waiting to be asked? And perhaps that was all he had ever been. When the clock reads 11:59, listen closely. Subscribe to the channel. Like, share, and leave a comment. Mash that notification bell so you don't miss a new video when it is out. Thanks for your support. See you in the next